There is a tendency to remember the Korean War as a contest of movement and firepower, a war defined by advances, reversals, and the eventual hardening of a front line. What is less often examined is how frequently outcomes were shaped by something quieter and more persistent. Water. Not the dramatic crossings of rivers, but the slow intrusion of moisture into boots, shelters, timber, and earthworks. In the northern sectors, especially during the freeze-thaw cycles that defined much of the conflict, water became a destabilizing force. It weakened fortifications, rotted materials, and turned otherwise defensible positions into liabilities. Units that failed to manage moisture found themselves fighting not just an enemy, but their own environment. And yet, long before this war, there were methods, refined in harsher climates, that addressed this exact problem with a level of precision that modern forces often overlooked. Moisture rarely appears in after-action reports as a decisive factor, yet it consistently undermines the assumptions that military planning depends on. In Korea, timber structures absorbed water during brief thaws and locked it in as temperatures dropped again. This cycle expanded cracks, weakened joints, and eventually led to structural failure. Trenches collapsed not because they were poorly dug, but because the materials supporting them had degraded in ways that were not immediately visible. Even well-supplied units found their equipment compromised when water seeped into storage and froze. The issue was not simply exposure to rain or snow, but the inability to control how materials interacted with water over time. Modern waterproofing solutions existed, but they were not always available, and in extreme cold they could fail unpredictably. What remained was a gap between what was needed and what could be supplied. It is in that gap that older, more adaptive methods begin to matter. Centuries earlier, across Scandinavia, builders working in environments defined by cold, damp conditions developed techniques that did not attempt to eliminate water, but to manage it. Among the most effective was a method combining controlled charring, natural resins, and layered construction. This approach is often associated with the seafaring culture of the Vikings, but it extended beyond ships into homes, storage structures, and defensive works. The principle was straightforward in concept, but precise in execution. Timber surfaces were lightly charred, creating a carbonized outer layer that resisted moisture penetration. This was not burning in the destructive sense, but a controlled process that sealed the wood while preserving its internal strength. After charring, the wood was treated with natural substances such as pine tar, which penetrated the surface and added an additional barrier against water and decay. Layers of construction were then arranged to allow water to shed naturally, rather than accumulate. This was not a single technique, but a system. Each step reinforced the others, creating a material that interacted with water differently. Instead of absorbing and retaining moisture, the treated wood repelled it, or allowed it to move across the surface without causing damage. Structures built using these techniques were not immune to environmental stress, but they degraded at a far slower rate. Roofs shed water efficiently. Walls resisted rot. Foundations remained stable even when the ground beneath them shifted with seasonal changes. In maritime contexts, similar treatments allowed wooden vessels to endure prolonged contact with saltwater without rapid deterioration. What is notable is that this durability did not depend on constant maintenance. Once properly treated, the materials required relatively little intervention. This stands in contrast to many modern solutions, which can offer strong initial protection, but degrade quickly if not reapplied or supported by stable conditions. In Korea, where conditions changed rapidly and maintenance opportunities were limited, such a self-sustaining approach would have addressed a critical vulnerability. Some units, drawing on local practices or improvising based on available materials, began to approximate aspects of this method, though often without the full system that made it most effective. Accounts from engineers and infantry units in the northern regions describe efforts to protect timber using fire and locally sourced oils. These were not framed as historical techniques, but as practical responses to immediate problems. Wood was scorched to harden its surface. Makeshift sealants were applied to slow water absorption. Structures were angled and layered to encourage runoff. The results were, well, uneven. But in cases where these adaptations were applied consistently, the difference was noticeable. Shelters remained dry longer. Support beams retained their integrity. Defensive positions required fewer repairs. These improvements did not change the course of the war in a dramatic sense, but they influenced the day-to-day endurance of the units involved. This is where the connection to earlier northern methods becomes significant. The underlying logic, working with environmental forces rather than attempting to exclude them entirely, reappeared under different conditions, driven by necessity rather than tradition. What the Viking builders understood, and what some soldiers in Korea rediscovered in fragments, is that water management is not about absolute prevention. It is about control. By altering the surface properties of wood and the way structures are assembled, it is possible to direct how water interacts with them. This has implications beyond military contexts. In any environment where moisture is a persistent factor, the durability of materials depends on how well their behavior is anticipated. Techniques that appear simple, charring, sealing with natural resins, designing for runoff, are effective because they align with the physical properties of the materials involved. Modern engineering often achieves similar results through synthetic means, but the principles remain the same. The difference is that traditional methods tend to be more adaptable in situations where industrial resources are limited or unavailable. In the decades following the Korean War, military training began to place greater emphasis on environmental adaptation. Survival manuals incorporated guidance on using local materials and modifying them to withstand specific conditions. While they did not explicitly reference Viking techniques, the parallels are clear in the emphasis on charring wood, applying natural sealants, and constructing shelters that shed water effectively. At the same time, architects and builders interested in sustainability have revisited these older methods. The practice of charring wood, for example, has gained renewed attention as a way to increase durability without relying on chemical treatments. Pine tar and similar substances are being reconsidered for their protective qualities and low environmental impact. What was once a matter of necessity in harsh climates has become a point of interest in a world increasingly concerned with resilience and resource efficiency. The dominant narratives of the war emphasize strategy and geopolitics, but they often leave out the smaller decisions that shaped outcomes on the ground. The way a shelter was built, the way timber was treated, the way water was managed, these factors rarely appear in official histories, yet they influence the ability of individuals and units to endure. The rediscovery, even in partial form, of techniques developed centuries earlier suggests that knowledge does not move in a straight line. It is lost, adapted, and sometimes re-emerges under pressure. In Korea, the conditions forced a reconsideration of assumptions about materials and construction, revealing the limits of relying solely on modern solutions. Understanding these details does not diminish the larger events of the war. It adds depth to them. It shows how survival often depends on the interaction between human decisions and environmental realities, and how solutions can come from unexpected places. Remembering these methods matters because they expand how we think about resilience. The Viking builders' approach to waterproofing was not designed for war, yet it addressed a problem that became critical in one of the 20th century's defining conflicts. That connection is worth examining, not because it offers a direct blueprint for modern use, but because it highlights the value of looking beyond familiar frameworks. Resilience is rarely the result of a single innovation. It is built from an understanding of materials, environments, and the ways they influence each other over time. The more we recognize the contributions of overlooked methods, the better equipped we are to respond to conditions that fall outside standard expectations. If this perspective adds something to your understanding of history, subscribe to History Vault for more explorations of the details that are often left out, and share this video with others who are interested in looking deeper.